When we look at history, we often hear a lot about Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But Africa? Not so much. However, Africa's history is incredibly rich and complex. It's not just a story of Europeans or Asians. Africa had its own powerful empires that shaped its destiny and even influenced the world. Let's dive into some of these fascinating stories. We'll start with ancient Egypt, one of the most famous civilizations ever. It all began around 3000 BCE along the Nile River. The Nile was like a lifeline for Egypt, providing food and a way to travel. The Egyptians built a society with kings called pharaohs who were thought to be gods. They had fancy buildings like the Great Pyramids, which are still standing today. The Egyptians were clever too, with their own system of writing called hieroglyphics. There were ups and downs in Egypt's history. The Old Kingdom was a time of pyramids and powerful pharaohs. Then came the Middle Kingdom, a period of stability and cultural growth. But Egypt faced tough times too, like when the Hyksos invaded. The New Kingdom was a time of resurgence for Egypt. They had mighty pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Tutankhamun, and they expanded their empire into places like Sudan and the Levant. Let's continue our journey through African history with two more fascinating empires. First up is the Kingdom of Kush, which was Egypt's neighbor to the south, in what is now Sudan. Kush had a really interesting relationship with Egypt. Sometimes they were friends, and other times they were enemies. Kush started around 1070 BCE, during a time when Egypt was having some problems of its own. What's cool about Kush is that they had their own unique culture, but they were also really into Egyptian stuff. They even built pyramids like the Egyptians did. One of the most exciting times in Kush's history was when they took over Egypt for a while. That was during the 25th dynasty, from 760 to 656 BCE. They were the rulers of Egypt, and it was a big deal for them. But unfortunately, their time in charge didn't last long. The Assyrians came along and defeated them, taking back control of Egypt. Even though Kush lost their grip on Egypt, they still stuck around for a while, just not as powerful as before. Now, let's talk about another powerful empire, the Carthage Empire. It was located in what we now call Tunisia, on the northern coast of Africa. Carthage was a big deal back in its day, founded way back in the 9th century BCE by some Phoenician folks. It quickly became a major trading hub and had a strong navy that controlled a bunch of territory around the Mediterranean Sea. One of the most famous things about Carthage is their conflicts with Rome. These two were like rivals, always fighting over who got to be in charge. It was a big deal and ended up shaping a lot of history in the Mediterranean region. Let's keep exploring African history with two more fascinating empires. Next up is the Mali Empire, which was a big deal in West Africa. The Mali Empire became powerful because it controlled trade routes across the Sahara Desert. It all started around the 9th century CE, when Mali was part of another empire called Ghana. But Mali gained independence and became its own empire in the 13th century, under a leader named Sundiata Keita. Mali grew fast, taking over lands in what is now Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and Niger. They were famous for their gold. In fact, Mali was so rich in gold that it became legendary, and the city of Timbuktu, located in Mali, became super important as a center of trade, culture, and learning. People from all over came to Timbuktu to study in its libraries and universities. One of the most famous guys from Mali was Mansa Musa, who ruled during the 14th century. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, and he went on this huge pilgrimage to Mecca. Along the way, he gave out so much gold that he became known as one of the richest people ever. But, like all good things, the Mali Empire eventually declined. There were fights within the empire, invasions from outside, and changes in trade routes that all contributed to its downfall. Now, let's talk about the Kingdom of Axum, which was in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. Axum was a big deal because it controlled trade routes along the Red Sea. This made them super rich and powerful, especially because they traded in things like ivory and spices. One of the coolest things about Axum is that they were one of the earliest Christian kingdoms. People think Christianity came to Axum in the 4th century CE, and it had a big impact on the region's culture and religion. Axum reached its peak in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, when it expanded its influence into places like the Arabian Peninsula and Sudan. King Ezana was a big part of Axum's success. He left behind inscriptions that tell us a lot about Axum's history and religion. But like a lot of empires, Axum eventually fell apart. This was partly because of the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests in the region. Axum broke into smaller states, but its Christian legacy lived on in the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches. Continuing our journey, let's explore 2 more remarkable empires of Africa. First, we have the Songhai Empire, which was located in West Africa along the Nile River. It became one of the biggest empires in African history after the Mali Empire. The Songhai Empire really thrived during the 16th century, thanks to some powerful leaders like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. Sunni Ali was the one who started it all, expanding the empire through military conquests. Then came Askia Muhammad, who brought stability and good leadership to the empire. What made the Songhai Empire special was how well it was organized. They had provinces with governors, and a central government took care of things like taxes, trade, and the military. Their capital city, Gao, was a bustling center of trade and culture. Under Askia Muhammad, the Songhai Empire got really big, stretching from the Atlantic coast all the way to Lake Chad. Islam was a big part of their empire, with places like Timbuktu being centers of Islamic learning. But like many empires, Songhai fell apart. One big blow was an invasion by the Moroccans in 1591. They had fancy new weapons like guns that the Songhai couldn't match. After that, the empire broke up into smaller states, and its great cities fell into ruins. Now, let's talk about the Benin Empire, which was in what is now Nigeria. The Benin Empire was known for its incredible art, especially its bronze sculptures. It started around the 13th century and did really well because of trade with neighboring states and European countries like Portugal. The capital city of Benin, which is now called Ado, was famous for its massive walls that stretched for miles. These walls kept the city safe and protected its valuable trade routes. But what really stands out about the Benin Empire is its art. Their craftsmen were amazing at making bronze and brass sculptures that showed off the kingdom's culture and life. These sculptures have had a big impact on art in Africa and beyond, admired for their beauty and detail. Let's continue our journey through African history with 2 more fascinating kingdoms. First, we have the Benin Empire, which was located in what is now Nigeria. The Benin Empire was ruled by a powerful king called the Oba, who had both political and spiritual authority. But things took a bad turn for Benin in the late 19th century when the British showed up. In 1897, the British led a punishment mission that ended with the sacking of Benin City, the looting of its treasures, and the exile of the Oba. Benin was basically taken over by the British and became part of their empire. Even though the empire itself disappeared, its culture and art are still remembered and honored today. Now, let's talk about the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, known for its incredible stone architecture. The most famous part of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe is Great Zimbabwe, a city built between the 11th and 15th centuries. It was huge, with massive stone walls, towers, and enclosures. Historians aren't entirely sure what Great Zimbabwe was used for, but it was probably a center of trade, religion, and government. The kingdom got rich from controlling trade routes in gold, ivory, and other valuable stuff. But for some reason, maybe changes in the environment or political problems, Great Zimbabwe was eventually abandoned, and the kingdom fell apart. Now let's move on to the Kingdom of Ghana, which was a big deal in West Africa. Ghana was all about trade, especially gold and salt. It started around the 6th century CE and was really good at protecting trade routes and collecting taxes from passing caravans. This made Ghana super wealthy, and its capital city, Kumbi, was a busy place with separate areas for Muslim traders and the king. But Ghana couldn't keep up forever. In the 11th century, some North African guys called the Almoravids invaded and messed things up. Ghana broke apart into smaller states and eventually disappeared as a united kingdom. And finally, let's talk about the kingdom of Axum, which was in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. Axum was famous for its giant stone obelisks and its role in trade between Africa, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. It was super rich, with big stone buildings and control over valuable stuff like ivory and gold. Axum was a big deal in ancient Africa and left a lasting impact on the region's history. Let's continue our exploration of African history with two more remarkable empires. First, we have the Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa. The Zulu Kingdom was formed by the Zulu people, who were really good at fighting. Under the leadership of Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century, they became a powerful force. Shaka introduced new tactics and weapons that made the Zulu army unbeatable. But when the British showed up and wanted to take over, the Zulus fought back in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. Sadly, they lost, and their lands were taken over. Despite this, Zulu culture and identity are still strong in modern South Africa. Next, let's talk about the Ashanti Empire, which was in what is now Ghana. The Ashanti Empire was known for its rich culture and art, especially their beautiful gold jewelry. They were also really good at resisting the British when they tried to take over. The Ashanti people had a strong government, with the king, known as the Asant, having a lot of power. The Ashanti army was disciplined and played a big role in defending the empire. Even though the British eventually took over, Ashanti culture and identity have persisted in Ghana. Now let's move on to the Yoruba Empire, which was in southwestern Nigeria. The Yoruba Empire was one of the most powerful states in West Africa before colonization. They had a centralized government with a supreme ruler called the Alafin and a council of chiefs to help with governance. The Yoruba were big on trade and collected taxes on stuff like kola nuts and slaves. They were also known for their beautiful art, especially wood carvings. The Yoruba Empire eventually faced internal conflicts and attacks from outside forces, which led to its decline. And finally, let's talk about the Kanem-Bornu Empire, which was in the region around Lake Chad. The Kanem-Bornu Empire was a big deal in the Sahel region. It started around the 9th century CE and was known for its strong government and Islamic culture. The rulers of the empire were called the Sef, and they controlled trade routes that connected Africa with the Arab world and Europe. Kanem-Bornu was an important player in the region until it eventually declined due to internal and external pressures. Let's wrap up our journey through African history with a look at two more important empires. First, we have the Kanem-Bornu Empire, located in the Sahel region. This empire played a big role in spreading Islam in the area. Islamic scholars and traders from North Africa and the Arab world visited Kanem-Bornu, which transformed the empire culturally and religiously. It reached its peak in the 16th century under the rule of Mai Idris Aluma, who expanded its territory and made military improvements. But like many empires, Kanem-Bornu faced challenges, including attacks from neighboring states and the decline of its power. Now, let's talk about the Swahili city-states, which were hubs of trade on the eastern coast of Africa. These city-states, like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar, were crucial in connecting Africa with the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia through maritime trade. They became wealthy and influential because of their role in this trade. The Swahili culture and language emerged from a mix of influences from Bantu, Arab, Persian, and Indian cultures. But the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century disrupted their trade routes, and other European powers also grew in influence, leading to the decline of the Swahili city-states over time. Overall, the decline of many African empires coincided with the onset of European colonialism. European powers, seeking resources and driven by imperial ambitions, carved up Africa during the scramble for Africa. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This colonial era had significant and lasting effects on Africa, disregarding traditional borders and ethnic divisions and reshaping the continent's future. The aftermath of colonial rule had a profound impact on Africa. Many African states lost their independence and endured years of foreign control. Colonial powers exploited Africa's resources, imposed new forms of governance, and enforced labor systems that were often brutal. African cultures and traditions suffered as they were oppressed or marginalized, and resistance was met with harsh repression. This legacy of colonialism still affects modern Africa, with many nations struggling to overcome its consequences. However, in the mid-20th century, a wave of independence movements swept across the continent. African nations began to break free from colonial rule, gaining their independence and forming new states. Yet, the journey to independence was not without its challenges. Newly independent countries faced the daunting task of nation-building, establishing political systems, developing economies, and creating national identities. Many struggled with ethnic and tribal divisions inherited from the colonial era, which threatened national unity. Throughout this period, African leaders and movements played crucial roles in the fight for independence and in shaping the future of their nations. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Patrice Lumumba of Congo, and Nelson Mandela of South Africa became symbols of African self-determination. However, independence also brought its own set of challenges. The legacy of colonialism, coupled with economic underdevelopment, political instability, and external pressures from the Cold War superpowers, posed significant hurdles for newly independent African nations to overcome. In recent decades, Africa has seen a mix of ups and downs. Some countries have made good progress in things like growing their economies, improving education, and taking care of people's health. But at the same time, a lot of countries are still dealing with tough issues like shaky governments, corruption, poverty, and conflicts. The history of Africa is like a huge tapestry made up of many different stories. From the ancient wonders of Egypt to the mighty empires of Mali and Sonai, from the amazing art of Benin to the religious traditions of Axum, Africa's past is incredibly rich and diverse. It's shaped not just the continent itself, but also the whole world. As we look back on these great African empires, we can see how resilient and adaptable African societies have been over time. They've faced lots of changes and pressures from outside, especially when colonialism came along. But even though many empires declined during this time, Africa's story didn't end there. After colonialism, African nations had to figure out who they were on their own. It wasn't easy, and there were lots of problems to deal with. But as we wrap up our journey through Africa's past, it's clear that the legacy of these empires lives on. They've left their mark on Africa's cultures, traditions, and identities, and they still inspire people today to learn more about the incredible history of this continent. Thanks for watching the video, and if you found it informative, please like and subscribe to Time Capsule for similar content. We look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. Until then, take care.